There are some stories that don't announce themselves loudly. They don't arrive with a crash of thunder or a sudden flash of light. They don't demand attention. They slip in quietly, almost politely, like a thought that drifts into the mind just before sleep, so softly that you barely notice it arriving, as if the story itself is unsure whether it should be told at all. This is one of those stories. It does not begin with a mystery, not in the way we usually expect. There is no locked room, no missing person, no unanswered question waiting in the dark. It begins with something far more ordinary, a child, a normal child, in a normal home, with small rooms filled with everyday sounds, the hum of a refrigerator late at night, the soft creak of a hallway floorboard, the muted glow of a nightlight spilling gently across the carpet. A house where mornings arrived quietly, where toys lay scattered beneath windows, and where nothing, at first, felt out of place. At least, at first. James Leininger was born in the late 1990s in the United States, into a world already busy and moving. To parents who lived modest, unremarkable lives, the kind of lives that leave little trace beyond family photographs and half-remembered conversations. They were not searching for meaning, not chasing mysteries. They were simply raising a child. James's early years passed without incident, without warning signs. He learned to walk, to speak, to laugh. There were no unusual habits, no strange fixations, no signs that anything was different from any other child his age. Until the dreams began. Not the kind of dreams children usually have. Not dreams of flying through the sky with effortless joy. Not shadows hiding beneath the bed. Not castles or monsters or imagined worlds. These dreams were different. They were sharp, heavy, persistent. They returned night after night, like waves that refused to retreat from the shore. James would wake suddenly, his small body rigid, his breath quick and uneven. Tears streaked across his face, his hands trembling as if still gripping something unseen. Sometimes he cried softly. Sometimes he screamed, a sound raw enough to pull his parents from sleep in an instant. Over and over again, he would repeat the same words, not as questions, but as statements. Plane crash. Fire. Can't get out. Each phrase fell from his mouth with unsettling clarity, as if he were describing something unfolding right in front of him. At first, his parents assumed it was a phase, the kind that passes as quietly as it arrives. Children dream, children imagine, children confuse memory with fantasy. Surely this would fade, but it didn't. As James grew a little older, the dreams did not soften. They sharpened. They gathered detail, texture, weight. He spoke of being trapped inside a burning aircraft, of heat pressing in from all sides, of thick smoke filling the small enclosed space. He described the ocean below, rising, rushing upward, as if the world itself were closing in. In his sleep, his body mirrored the struggle. He kicked, twisted, clenched his fists, as though fighting against restraints only he could see. When his parents rushed to his side, whispering reassurance, telling him it was only a dream, James would shake his head. It's real. It already happened. That was the first thing that unsettled them. Not fear, but certainty. the calm, unyielding way he said it. They tried to reason it away. Children absorb fragments of the world around them, images from television, sounds from overheard conversations, scenes from books or movies glimpsed too young. Perhaps he had seen something accidentally. A documentary playing in the background, an old war film left on too long. So they became careful. They watched what James watched, listened more closely to what he heard. They avoided anything violent, anything involving planes, anything tied to war. They created a soft, safe world around him. But the dreams continued, unchanged, uninterrupted. And then, something else happened. James began talking about the plane while he was awake, not as play, not as imagination, but as recollection. He spoke about the aircraft with startling precision, using words his parents did not recognize, technical terms, specific descriptions, words no toddler should know. He corrected adults casually, without arrogance, without hesitation. That's not the right kind of plane. That one doesn't land on water. When his father asked how he knew this, expecting a shrug or a guess, James answered simply, "I used to fly it." At around 2 years old, James developed a fascination with airplanes, not toy planes, not cartoon shapes with smiling faces, real planes. Metal, rivets, wings. He could identify models, recognize markings, distinguish between aircraft types, as if sorting memories rather than learning new facts. And most strangely, he insisted on one detail. The plane he remembered was shot down, one night after another restless sleep. James said something that caused his parents to pause. "My plane was hit. It went down in the water." Then, almost as an afterthought, "They couldn't get me out," his mother asked gently, her voice low, careful not to startle him. "Who is they?" James answered without hesitation, "My friends." This was no longer random imagery. It was a narrative, a story that returned unchanged, night after night, detail after detail, like a memory replaying itself. And it always ended the same way. With fire, with the ocean, with no escape. His parents were torn. They did not believe in reincarnation. They had no reason to. And yet, they were listening to their son describe something far beyond ordinary childhood fantasy. Something structured, something technical, something emotional, and always something tragic. Then came the name, one quiet afternoon, as James played nearby. He spoke again. "My name used to be James." His parents smiled, assuming confusion. But then he added, "My other name was different." When asked what it was, James paused, as if searching through a drawer of memories, and said, "James Houston." The name meant nothing to them. They dismissed it, filed it away as coincidence. Yet something about it lingered, like a word heard in a dream that refuses to fade upon waking. As weeks passed, more fragments emerged. James talked about taking off from a ship he called the Natoma. He spoke of missions, of long stretches of ocean below. He described the sound of the engine. the deep vibration that hummed through the aircraft. And always, the moment it ended. By now, his parents were deeply unsettled, not frightened, but confused. They began writing things down, dates, phrases, names, not knowing why, only knowing they didn't want to forget. One day, while looking through a book about airplanes, James pointed to a photograph. "That's the one I flew." His father leaned closer. It was a World War II fighter plane, used by the US Navy. When asked again how he knew, James replied calmly, "Because I was there." At this point, the line between imagination and memory had blurred completely. James wasn't pretending. He wasn't acting. He was recalling something, whether real or not, whether possible or not, it was real to him. And then came the final detail, the one that would later become impossible to ignore. When asked where the plane crashed, James said, "Near Iwo Jima," a name he could not pronounce perfectly, yet one he somehow knew, a place bound tightly to history, to fire and ocean, to one of the fiercest battles of the Second World War. His parents exchanged a glance. This was no longer just a childhood phase, no longer just a bad dream. Something else was happening, something they could not explain. And so, quietly, cautiously, they began asking questions. Questions that would lead them into a story far larger than they ever expected. A story that would stretch across decades, across records, across names, across history itself. And this was only the beginning. As James grew older, the memories did not fade. They didn't disappear the way childhood fantasies usually do. They didn't blur or dissolve with time. They settled, like sediment drifting slowly to the bottom of still water. Quiet, unmoving, becoming less urgent, but more defined. Almost as if they were waiting for the right moment, the right question, the right silence. His parents, still unsure what to think, continued writing everything down. Not because they believed anything extraordinary was happening, not because they were searching for meaning, but because something about the consistency unsettled them. Children forget, they embellish, they contradict themselves. Stories change shape in young minds. James's did not. Months passed. The nightmares grew less frequent, arriving now only occasionally, like distant storms that no longer reached the house. But during the day, the memories became clearer, sharper. James spoke of them calmly now, without fear, without distress, as if he were describing something already finished, something complete, something already accepted. One quiet afternoon, while the television murmured softly in the background, a documentary played. Images of the open sea, of ships moving steadily across wide stretches of water. James looked up suddenly. He pointed at the screen. "That's where my plane took off." His father paused the video. The image froze on a long, narrow deck, flat and grey, surrounded on all sides by endless blue. An aircraft carrier. James nodded gently. "That's it." When asked how he knew, he didn't hesitate. I remember the deck. His voice was soft, certain, as though recalling the layout of a familiar room. Curiosity deepened. His parents began testing the edges of this knowledge, not aggressively, not skeptically, just gently. They showed him photographs of different ships, different planes, different uniforms, some from different eras, some from different countries. James studied each image carefully, then corrected them when they were wrong. That one's British. That one can't land on water. That's not the right time. Each correction was offered without pride, without excitement, just quiet certainty, like someone correcting a map. It was around this time that James began speaking more about the crash. Not in fragments anymore, not as isolated images, but as a sequence, a beginning, a middle, an end. He spoke of taking off, the engine vibrating beneath him, the ship shrinking behind. He spoke of flying toward a target, the sky wide and empty, the ocean stretching endlessly below, then being hit. And after that, silence, when his mother asked gently what happened next. Her voice careful, measured. James paused, his gaze drifting somewhere distant. The plane broke. It fell fast. His words were calm, but his hands trembled slightly, as if remembering something physical, something heavy. Concerned, his parents sought advice. They spoke with pediatricians, with psychologists. They listened patiently to professional explanations. Children have vivid imaginations. Children absorb more than we realize. Children construct narratives from fragments. None of these explanations satisfied them. Not because they wanted to believe something extraordinary, but because none of them accounted for the details, the precision, the consistency, the calm certainty. One evening, James asked for a toy airplane. Not just any airplane, a very specific one. When his parents brought him something similar, bright, simplified, James shook his head. That's not it. Eventually, after some searching, his father found a model of a World War II Corsair fighter plane. When he placed it in front of James, James smiled. That's it. His father froze. The Corsair was not a common aircraft, not one children typically recognized. It was a real fighter plane, used by US Navy pilots, known for carrier landings and combat missions in the Pacific. James had never been taught this. Curiosity turned quietly into concern. His parents began researching the things James mentioned, not obsessively, not desperately, just cautiously, like people following a trail they hadn't intended to find. They looked up the ship James had named, the Natoma Bay. To their surprise, it existed. The USS Natoma Bay was a real escort carrier, active during World War II, operating in the Pacific Theater. The same theater, the same ocean, the same region James described. A quiet unease settled over them. Not fear, recognition. They decided to test one detail. James had mentioned repeatedly being shot down near Iwo Jima. They found a map, spread it across the table. James didn't hesitate. He pointed immediately. Right there, his finger rested on the ocean, just off the island, still trying to remain rational, still clinging to coincidence. They looked up records of pilots lost near Iwo Jima. There were many, too many. This alone proved nothing. Then they searched one specific name, James, Houston. They expected nothing. Perhaps a coincidence. Perhaps no record at all. Instead, they found a file. James M. Houston Jr., U.S. Navy pilot, killed in action. March 3rd, 1945. Aircraft lost near Iwo Jima. The room fell silent. This was no longer a vague similarity. The name matched. The location matched. The aircraft matched. The ship matched. Even the timeline. James had never heard this name spoken aloud. Not from family. Not from friends. Not from television or books. Yet here it was. His parents did not tell him what they had found. They did not want to influence him. They waited, observed, listened. Over the following weeks, James offered more pieces, small fragments, offered casually. He spoke of a friend, another pilot. When asked his name, James replied simply, Jack. Later research revealed a pilot named Jack Larson, who served aboard the same carrier. Each new detail tightened the pattern, not perfectly, but uncomfortably close. Still, his parents resisted conclusions. They reminded themselves, coincidences happen. Memory is strange. Children surprise us. But the calmness of James's recollections lingered. He wasn't excited. He wasn't seeking attention. He spoke as if remembering an old job, an old place, something long finished. At one point, his mother asked a simple question. Why do you think you remember these things? James thought for a moment, then said, Because I came back. There was no drama in his voice, no insistence, just quiet acceptance. That night, his parents sat together in silence. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Something had shifted. They were no longer asking if this was imagination. They were asking what it meant. Eventually, they made a careful decision. They would keep learning, not to prove anything, not to convince anyone, but to understand. And so, they continued following the trail, through archives, through history, through records untouched for decades, unaware that this quiet search would soon draw attention. From researchers, from psychologists, from people who had heard stories like this before, stories of children, with memories they could not explain. But that part of the story still lay ahead, for now there was only a boy, a name, a ship in the Pacific, and a mystery unfolding slowly. Like the tide. If you'd like, I can match part 3 and part 4 to this exact richness. Adjust imagery to be even softer for deep sleep, or tune pacing to hit a precise runtime target. Just say the word. As the months passed, James continued to grow, not just in height or age, but in quiet, subtle ways. His voice steadied, his movements softened. His days filled with the small, ordinary rhythms of childhood. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The memories began to quiet, not vanish, not dissolve, but settle, like leaves drifting gently to the bottom of a still pond, remaining visible, but no longer moving, as if they had said what they needed to say. By the time James reached school age, the nightmares had almost completely stopped. No more sudden cries in the night, no frantic calls from the bedroom. He slept peacefully now, breathing slow and even, wrapped in the simple safety of sleep, without fear, without agitation. Yet when asked about the plane, or the ship, or the name he once used, he could still recall them, calmly, clearly, as though opening a book he hadn't read in a long time, but never forgot. This change intrigued his parents. They had expected the memories to fade, to blur, to scatter with time. Instead, they remained intact, but no longer demanded attention. Like a story that had reached its final page, still remembered, but no longer being told. Around this time, James's parents made a careful decision. They would share what they had found, not publicly, not with reporters or cameras, but quietly, with a small group of researchers, people who studied childhood memory, and rare cases like this one. These researchers approached the story slowly, with skepticism, with patience, with an awareness of how easily stories can shift, how gently suggestion can shape memory. They did not begin by believing. They began by listening. They asked James simple questions, open-ended ones, questions designed not to lead, not to suggest, not to plant ideas. James answered easily, sometimes vaguely, sometimes with surprising clarity, as though some memories had softened, while others remained sharp. When shown photographs of World War II aircraft, James identified the Corsair again. Without hesitation, his finger resting briefly on the image, as if recognizing an old acquaintance. When asked about the ship, he described its deck, its narrowness, its long open stretch. Details later confirmed through archival photographs, images taken decades before James was born. Still, the researchers remained cautious. They understood how memory works, how easily the mind fills in gaps. So they tested what James did not know. They asked about aircraft he had never mentioned, ships unrelated to the Natoma Bay. James showed no recognition, no guesses, no uncertainty, just absence. This distinction mattered. It suggested that James wasn't guessing, wasn't drawing broadly from imagination. His memories appeared selective, specific, like a photograph album with only a few pages intact. The researchers then turned to historical records, mission logs, casualty reports, eyewitness accounts. They worked slowly, carefully, cross-referencing, verifying, piece by piece. What they found was unsettling, not because everything matched perfectly, but because enough of it did. James M. Houston Jr. had been a pilot aboard the USS Natoma Bay. On March 3, 1945, he was flying a Corsair fighter, assigned to a mission near Iwo Jima. His plane was hit. Witnesses reported it crashing into the ocean, with no sign of escape. James Leininger had described the same sequence, years before anyone shared this information with him. Still, the researchers resisted conclusions. They did not speak of reincarnation, not yet. They spoke instead of anomalies, of unexplained consistencies, of rare but documented cases that sit quietly at the edges of understanding. Throughout this process, James remained largely unaffected. He did not appear disturbed by the attention, nor did he seek it. He did not cling to the identity or insist on its importance. In fact, he seemed increasingly disinterested. When asked recently about the dreams, James shrugged. They stopped. When asked why, he paused, thinking, and said, "Because I remembered." This answer lingered with the researchers, not as evidence, but as insight. Some theorized that the memories served a purpose, a way for the mind to resolve something unfinished, something incomplete. Once resolved, the memories could rest. Others offered different explanations. That the mind may access information in ways not yet understood. That consciousness may not be as contained as we assume. That identity itself might be more fluid, more layered than we believe. None of these ideas were proven. None were dismissed outright. They remained possibilities. What remained undeniable was the impact. James grew into a thoughtful child, curious, grounded, with no lingering trauma, no fixation on the past, no desire to be someone else. In interviews years later, he spoke about the experience with distance, almost as if recalling a dream from long ago, something meaningful, but no longer present. His parents reflected often on those early years, on how close they had come to ignoring it, to dismissing it as imagination, to letting it fade without question. They did not claim to have answers. They did not attempt to persuade anyone. They simply told the story and allowed others to draw their own conclusions. Because stories like this do not ask to be believed, they ask to be considered. As time moved on, and James stepped fully into his own life, the question remained, not just about James, but about memory itself. Where does it come from? What does it belong to? And why? Sometimes, does it refuse to stay silent? These questions linger quietly, not demanding answers, only reflection. And as night deepens, and the world slows, they drift, like thoughts at the edge of sleep. As James continued to grow, something subtle yet unmistakable began to take shape. The memories were no longer centered on him. They no longer clung to his days or interrupted his nights. They were becoming part of something wider, a larger story. One that belonged not to childhood, but to history. To people who had lived full lives long before James was born. People whose voices had faded, but whose traces remained, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the focus shifted away from the child himself and toward what his memories had quietly uncovered. James's parents began to understand something important. Whatever had happened, whatever these memories were, They were not meant to continue indefinitely. There was no message left to deliver, no warning to pass on, no unfinished task waiting to be completed. Only a story that had surfaced briefly, like something rising from deep water, and now was gently receding. At a certain point, they chose to reach out to the family of the pilot whose name James had spoken. Carefully, respectfully, aware that they were stepping into a space shaped by loss, unsure how their words would be received, or whether they would be welcome at all. To their surprise, they were met not with disbelief, nor anger, but with quiet curiosity. The family had lived with absence for decades. A young man gone. A life interrupted mid-flight, a future that never had the chance to unfold. Photographs remained, stories repeated across generations, memories softened by time. As details were compared, dates, images, records, a strange sense of familiarity emerged. Not certainty, not proof, but resonance, like hearing an echo and recognizing its shape. Even if its source could not be seen, the pilot had loved airplanes, had spoken passionately about flying, about the sensation of lift, about the endless horizon of the ocean below. He had written letters home describing the ship, the deck, the camaraderie of the pilots who flew beside him. Details James had spoken of without ever being told. And yet, what struck everyone most was James himself. There was no dramatic moment of recognition, no emotional declaration, no claim of identity. James listened quietly, politely. He asked a few questions, then sat back, as if the story belonged to someone else, which in a way it did. He did not say this was me. He did not insist on ownership. He seemed content to let the story rest in the past, to let it remain where it belonged. That alone told the researchers something important. If this was imagination, it was an unusual kind. If it was memory, it had already served its purpose. As time passed, the attention surrounding the case slowly faded. Researchers moved on to other work. Papers were written. Interviews concluded. The world, always restless, found new mysteries to examine. James returned fully to the rhythms of ordinary life. He went to school, made friends, learned, played. He discovered interests entirely his own, unrelated to planes, unrelated to war. His days filled with laughter, homework, small challenges, small victories. His life unfolded, as it should. Occasionally, someone would ask him about the dreams, about the plane, the ship, the memories. James would pause, as if searching a distant room of his mind, and say quietly, "It feels far away now." There was no sadness in his voice. If anything, there was relief, as though something heavy had finally been set down. His parents reflected often on those early years, on how quickly something extraordinary had entered their lives, and how quietly it had left. Not with answers, not with resolution, but with a kind of peace. They did not try to explain it. They did not feel the need to convince anyone. They simply told the story when asked, and allowed others to sit with it in their own way. Because some mysteries do not exist to be solved. They exist to remind us of the limits of what we understand. The researchers who studied the case were careful in their conclusions. They spoke neither of reincarnation as established fact, nor of coincidence as simple explanation. Instead, they spoke of open questions. Questions about memory, about consciousness, about how identity forms. They acknowledged what science currently understands and what remains beyond its reach, that the human mind is capable of things we have not yet fully mapped. That consciousness may not be as neatly contained as once believed. That identity may be shaped not only by the present, but by echoes we do not yet know how to measure, and that occasionally stories emerge, quiet ones, stories that sit at the edges of explanation, neither demanding belief nor dismissal. James's case became one among many. Similar stories from around the world, children recalling places they had never visited, names they had never been taught, events they could not have learned, each story different, each incomplete, each leaving room for interpretation. Some listeners found comfort in these stories, others felt unease. Some dismissed them entirely, and many simply listened. Because stories like this do not insist. They invite us to consider what memory truly is, where it lives, and how it moves. Is memory stored only in the brain, or shaped by something wider? Something shared, something not yet understood? Is identity fixed and final, or does it echo in ways that soften with time, but never entirely disappear? There are no answers here, only questions, quiet ones. As James grew older, the story no longer followed him. It rested, preserved in records, in interviews, in the quiet recollections of those who witnessed it. And James himself became simply James. He did not carry the weight of the past. He did not look backward. He moved forward. That may be the most important part of this story, not the mystery itself, but how gently it released its hold. Whatever the memories were, they did not cling. They did not demand attention forever. They came, they were acknowledged, and they faded. Perhaps that is how many things resolve, not with answers, but with acceptance. Somewhere, a story was remembered, and then allowed to rest. And now, as this story draws quietly to a close, there is nothing left to explain, nothing left to question, only the understanding that not everything needs to be known. Some things are simply carried for a while, and then set down, and as your mind listens, it can do the same. The details can soften, the edges blur, the story has finished, and it can remain where it belongs. In the past, you don't need to hold on to it anymore. You can let it drift, and as the final words fade, you are free to rest,